The conference room was filling up in the way conference rooms do when nobody truly wants to be there before 9. Slow, deliberate, everyone finding a chair that communicated just enough distance from the head of the table to signal they had better things to do. Connor Hahn arrived early. He always did. Coffee in hand, onboarding agenda in the other. The same practiced calm he had worn for so long that most people mistook it for disinterest. At 49, he had stopped expecting to be surprised. Not because the world had grown small, but because people, when they walked into rooms like this one, almost always presented the exact version of themselves they had rehearsed in the elevator ride up. He had learned to be patient with that. It was a reasonable survival strategy. He took his seat, set down the coffee, and swept the room the way he had been doing for 2 decades without noticing. A single glance that registered exits, power dynamics, who was already checking their phone, and who was pretending not to check it. That was when he saw her. Vivian Okafor Barnes. 3rd chair to the left of the table's head. Caramel blazer. Notebook already open, pen already uncapped. Not because the meeting had started, but because she was the kind of person who arrived prepared for the meeting to start late and refused to waste the gap. She smiled when the HR coordinator introduced her. The exact dose of warmth that says, "I am here, I am professional, I am not asking anything from any of you." Everyone in that room registered. Competent new hire. Connor registered something else. He watched her hold the strap of her bag in her lap. 2 fingers, constant, the way you hold something when you need one point of contact with the ground. He watched the half-beat pause before each answer, not hesitation, but deliberate control. The kind built over years by someone who learned that unfiltered reactions have a price. He watched her breathe a millimeter deeper before speaking. Watched her shoulders drop the same millimeter after someone finally moved on to the next question. She was present, functional, immaculate, and she was holding it all in place with a force most people in that room would never register as force because it looked, from the outside, exactly like ease. Connor didn't know the name of the weight. Didn't know if it was grief or a loss of a different kind. The slow kind, the kind that leaves no bruise but empties a room of all its air while you're still standing in it. He had no way to know any of that. What he knew was what he recognized, the posture of someone running on discipline alone. And he knew, in the quiet way that certainty sometimes arrives, that it had a limit. What he didn't know was that Vivian Okafor Barnes had also spent 11 years learning to read a room. And in that same 40-minute meeting, she had clocked the exact moment he stopped watching the presentation and started watching her. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she'd misread it. She had been doing that for years, misreading, overcorrecting, retreating before anything had the chance to become something she'd have to name. She gathered her notebook, capped her pen, and walked out of that conference room with her spine straight and her expression even. But her hand never let go of the bag strap. If you have ever walked into a room performing strength you didn't entirely have left, you already know what comes next. The question is, what happens the first time someone refuses to believe the performance? The second week at Meridian, Vivian established her systems. She arrived at 7:50, 10 minutes before the floor filled. She liked the empty office, the honest version of a place, before people arranged themselves into their professional performances. She liked that the coffee machine was hers alone for those 10 minutes, that the lobby's floor-to-ceiling glass threw lake light across the marble without anyone standing in the way of it. Chicago in October had a specific quality of morning, cold and precise, that she found easier to inhabit than warmth. She had moved from Detroit 3 months ago, sold the furniture, changed the city, started with a suitcase and 2 boxes of books, and the particular determination of a woman who had decided that this time, the new life would actually be new. Her coffee was made. Her laptop was open. She had a 90-page property management report on the screen that she needed to cross-reference with the operational data before the Wednesday meeting, when the chair across from her desk pulled back, and a mug appeared on the corner of her workspace. She looked up. No one was there. She looked at the mug. Black coffee. No sleeve. The kind the machine on the executive floor made. She hadn't been to that floor yet. There was no note. There was no name. There was only the fact that the coffee was exactly the right temperature, which meant it had been placed there not more than 4 minutes ago. Vivian looked around the open floor. It was 8:02. The office was still mostly empty. She picked up the mug, drank one careful sip, set it back down, and returned to the report. She told herself she'd ask about it later. She didn't ask about it. Later became the next day, and the day after that, and the coffee kept appearing. Always before 8, always at the corner of her desk, always the right temperature. And Vivian kept drinking it without comment because to comment would be to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge it would be to make it into something. And she wasn't ready to make anything into something yet. By Thursday of that week, she had identified the pattern. Connor Hand's office was on the same floor. He arrived, she had learned, at exactly 7:50. The executive floor machine was 40 steps from the elevator bank. He would have passed her desk on the way to the far conference room he used every morning for what Marcus, his assistant, called the standing hour. The 60 minutes Connor spent reviewing the day's operational status without sitting down, which everyone agreed was unusual, and nobody had ever asked him to explain. The coffee was from him. She was 90% certain of this. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. The coffee kept appearing, warm and without ceremony, and Vivian finished it every morning down to the last cold sip, in a way she hadn't finished a coffee in longer than she could track. The Wednesday meeting arrived. 40 people, 2 conference rooms linked by a shared screen, the quarterly operational summary that everyone pretended was just a review, and everyone knew was actually a performance evaluation for every person seated at those tables. Vivian had 3 slides. She had rehearsed them. She had them memorized. What she hadn't done was cross-reference the December occupancy projections against the updated zoning amendment that Meridian's legal team had filed 2 weeks prior, a filing that changed 3 of her numbers in ways that, if presented as she'd prepared them, would generate a question she couldn't answer without looking unprepared in front of the company's 3 largest property owners. She discovered this at 7:47 that morning. The meeting started at 8:30. She pulled up the zoning amendment, read it, cross-referenced, recalculated. Her coffee was untouched and cold by the time she looked up and realized she had exactly 4 minutes before she had to walk into that room. Then her laptop pinged. An internal document share, no message, from Connor Hahn. A single revised data table, the exact 3 figures she needed, already formatted to match her slide template. He couldn't have known what she needed, unless he had reviewed her slides as part of his own meeting prep and caught the discrepancy himself, unless he had been up at 6 in the morning running the same cross-reference she'd missed, unless he had decided, without telling her, to cover the gap without making it visible. Vivian sat very still for 1 moment. Then she updated the slides, walked into the conference room, and presented without a stumble. Afterward, in the hallway, their paths crossed for exactly 5 seconds. He was heading toward the elevator bank. She was heading toward the water cooler she didn't need. He looked at her once, brief and even, and said, "Good presentation." That was all. She went back to her desk and stared at the wall for 30 seconds, something cracking open in her chest in a way she didn't have a name for yet. The kind of thing you feel when someone does something for you quietly, without asking for credit, without making it a debt. The kind of thing she hadn't felt in a very long time. She would not sleep well that night. She knew it even before she got home. She assumed after that she had the measure of Connor Hahn. She would spend the next 3 weeks discovering how wrong she was. By the 3rd week, Vivian had a reputation. Not a dramatic one, nothing that announced itself in hallways or got discussed at lunch. It was the quieter kind. The reputation of someone who handles things. Who doesn't forward problems upstream. Who can be handed a half-collapsed project, a complicated tenant complaint, a contract drafted by someone who had clearly been thinking about something else, and return 3 days later with a solution that looked like it had always been obvious. Diane Caldwell noticed first. "You know," Diane said, appearing at Vivian's desk on a Thursday afternoon with a post-it on her left palm that said, "Revise Clause 8B" in aggressive blue ink. You're allowed to ask for the manual. Vivian looked up from the lease renegotiation she'd been annotating for an hour. I'm sorry? The internal one. The one that explains which systems talk to which other systems and why 7 different project codes can mean the same building depending on who's entering data. Diane sat in the chair across from her like it was already hers. I built it last year after I spent 3 months reverse engineering the same thing. Nobody tells new people it exists. Why not? Diane tilted her head. Because knowing it exists is a kind of power, and people here are stingy about that. A pause. Forwarding it to you now. Vivian felt something ease in her chest. Not dramatically. Just a half-degree turn toward open. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me like that, Diane said. Thank me like I handed you a coffee, not like I saved your life. Vivian noticed, with some discomfort, that the two were not entirely different things. That same Thursday, she had her first real conversation with Richard Voss. He appeared at her office door frame at 4:30, tailored charcoal suit, silver hair perfectly arranged, a smile calibrated to say, I have decided to take an interest in you, without the warmth that sentence should carry. He was 54, and had been at Meridian for 16 years, which in this company was the equivalent of geological record. He moved through the building with the specific ease of a man who had never had to wonder if he was welcome anywhere. Vivian. He said her name like he'd been practicing it. I wanted to check in. How's the integration going? Well, she said. Thank you. Good. He stepped inside without being invited, the kind of move that reads as easy confidence until you name it. I wanted you to know. I've been paying attention to your work on the Streeterville portfolio review. Strong instincts. I appreciate that. I think there might be a real opportunity for you to take the lead on the River North consolidation project, he said. It's high visibility, exactly the kind of thing that shapes a career here. He said it the way gifts are offered by people who need something returned. Vivian had been in enough rooms to recognize the texture of it, the compliment as leverage, the opportunity as a leash. That's very generous, she said. I'll review the project scope. He left with a shoulder squeeze that she stored in the folder marked, Note This. She opened the River North project brief, read it for 30 minutes. The scope was real, the visibility was real, and the reporting line, that was the problem. The project sat formally under Voss's division, which meant any decision she made would require his signature, his framing, his particular spin before it reached the board. It was a gilded cage wearing the face of a promotion. She closed the brief and stared out at the lake. At 6:15, she heard the quiet of the floor around her and realized she was the last one still at her desk. She got up, gathered her things, and was halfway to the elevator when she passed the frosted glass of the small annex conference room and saw Connor Hahn standing at the window, alone, holding his usual mug of coffee that was certainly cold by now, looking at the city like he was asking it a question. She stopped. He turned his head slightly, as if he'd heard her pause, though she hadn't made a sound. She walked on. But for the rest of the evening, riding the blue line home, she thought not about the Voss offer, not about the lease renegotiation, not about the system manual Diane had sent. She thought about the way a man could stand at a window with cold coffee and look at a city like he was asking it something personal, and whether that was loneliness or just quiet, and whether, at some point, the difference stopped mattering. She told herself the distinction was important. She was starting to suspect she was wrong. It happened on a Friday, the kind of Friday that isn't one incident but an accumulation. A client who calls 3 times about a clause they approved 6 weeks ago, a building systems report that reveals a plumbing issue that should have been flagged in August, an email from a former colleague in Detroit that asks cheerfully, "How's the new chapter going?" and lands somewhere in her chest like a stone. She didn't have a name for what today was. She had stopped keeping track of the calendar in certain specific ways 2 years ago, when the marriage finally became what it had been for longer. A careful, polite arrangement between 2 strangers who shared a home and had, at some point she could not precisely locate, stopped trying to find each other in it. She had been the one who left. She needed to remember that. She had been the one who packed, who signed, who said, "This is not enough for either of us," in a voice steadier than she'd expected. She had made the decision. That was supposed to make it easier to carry. It did not always make it easier to carry. The break room on the 32nd floor was empty at 5:47. She stood at the counter with her coffee, the fourth of the day, which she already knew she wouldn't drink, and looked at nothing in particular. The window showed the river going copper with evening light. She tracked it without feeling it. She didn't hear him come in. "Hey." Connor's voice, even and unhurried. He moved to the coffee machine with the ease of someone who wasn't performing casual. He wasn't asking her to explain herself. He wasn't asking anything. She didn't turn around. "Hi." Silence. The machine hummed. She heard him set his mug down. Then, "You don't have to look okay all the time around here." 7 words. No follow-up. No question mark. Not even said with particular tenderness. Just stated, the way you state a fact you want someone to have access to. She finally turned. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his coffee in the machine, waiting for it to fill, unhurried. Just a man at a coffee machine on a Friday evening who had said one true thing and was now prepared to let it live on its own. She had no idea what to do with it. She said, "I'll keep that in mind." He nodded once, picked up his mug, left. She stood there for 3 minutes after that. The coffee on the counter cooled beside her. She didn't drink it. She thought about all the times. In 11 years of marriage, she had answered fine to the question, "How are you?" from a man she lived with. She thought about how many times the question had been genuine, and she'd deflected anyway, because showing the real answer felt like a weight she was putting on someone else. She thought about the particular loneliness of being the one who holds it together, and having no one notice that holding it together is a form of labor. And she thought about how Connor Hahn had not asked if she was okay. He hadn't asked anything. He had only told her, plainly, that the performance wasn't required. She went home and could not settle. She made dinner and didn't eat it. She sat on the floor of her living room. She still didn't have a proper couch, 3 months in, and tried to read a novel and read the same paragraph 4 times. She was not thinking about a man she had known for 3 weeks. She was thinking about a sentence. That was different. She was almost certain that was different. What she didn't account for was that some sentences don't stay sentences. Some of them become rooms you can't stop walking into. The River North project brief was 112 pages. Vivian read it over the weekend, all of it, including the appendices, which most people treated as furniture, the kind of document section that exists as proof of thoroughness rather than substance. Appendix C, which covered the division reporting structure and signatory authority, was where she found it. Clause 7, paragraph 3, subparagraph B. In plain language, any operational decision on properties within the River North consolidation, maintenance contracts, tenant negotiations, capital allocation, would require co-sign from both the assigned project manager and the VP of Business Development until the consolidation reached Phase 2. Phase 2 was 18 months away, which meant that for a year and a half, every significant decision Vivian made on that project would require Richard Voss's name beside hers. She set the brief down. She was at her kitchen table with no furniture and the lake in the distance through the window. And she thought about that with the careful, depersonalized attention of someone who has been burned before and learned to take temperature before touching anything. Monday morning, 9:15. She passed the open doorway of Connor's office and, for a reason she did not examine closely, stopped. He was on a call, standing with his back partly to the door. She was about to keep walking when he turned, saw her, and held up one finger. A minute. She waited. It felt like a decision. He ended the call. Looked at her. "River North?" She paused. "How did you—" Voss mentioned it at the directors' meeting Thursday. He didn't move, didn't lean forward. gave her exactly the amount of space the conversation needed. "I had a look at the brief. Clause 7b, she said. Clause 7b, he confirmed. Which Voss wrote, not legal. Something shifted in her chest. The specific relief of being understood without having to explain. "So the reporting structure is his design," she said. "The whole project has been waiting for the right person to front it. Someone whose credibility he can use to get the board interested, and whose decisions he can then shape from behind the signatory requirement." He said it without editorializing. Just the fact of it. She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" He seemed to genuinely consider the question. "Because you already knew something was off. I just confirmed the specific part." That was true. And somehow that made it worse, the precision of being read correctly. "What would you do?" she asked. It came out before she decided to ask it. He picked up his coffee. Cold, she was almost certain, and seemed to think about that honestly. "I'd go back to him with a counter-proposal. Express interest in the project, but request a modified reporting structure based on a precedent in the Streeterville portfolio from 2 years ago. That one had clean cosign only at phase transitions, not day-to-day decisions. There's legal precedent for it internally. He'd know you read the clause, which tells him something." "That I read everything." "That you read everything," he agreed. She left his office 10 minutes later with the Streeterville precedent document already in her email, sent by Marcus before she'd reached the elevator. She stood at the elevator bank and stared at the down button. This was the moment she should have filed under useful colleague. A professional exchange. A piece of internal knowledge that saved her from a structural trap. Clean, practical, and finished. But she stood there longer than the elevator took, running back through the conversation. And what she kept returning to was not the clause or the counter-proposal or the legal precedent. It was the way he had said, "Because you already knew something was off." The way being known correctly, not managed, not reassured, not handled, felt like a language she had almost forgotten existed. She got on the elevator. She pressed the button for her floor. She did not feel fine, but for the first time in a while, not fine felt like something she could work with. She was about to counter-propose to Richard Voss. She had no idea he was already planning his next move. "Tell me something," Diane said. They were at the coffee cart on the second floor. The real one, the one that wasn't the machine, where a man named Paolo made an Americano that cost $4 and was worth considerably more. It was 11:30 on a Tuesday, 3 days after Vivian had submitted her counter-proposal on the River North structure, and Voss had accepted it with a cordiality that felt faintly like the moment before weather. "Depends on what?" Vivian said. "Has Connor Hahn ever looked at you like he looks at—" "No, scratch that." Diane accepted her coffee from Paolo, stirred it twice, and reconsidered her approach. "Does he ever come by your desk?" Vivian kept her expression neutral. She had been practicing that since the age of 9. "We work on the same floor." "That's not an answer." "He came by last week about the Streeterville precedent review." A pause. "He sent over a document earlier this month." "The zoning table," Diane said immediately. Vivian looked at her. "How do you know about that?" "Because I saw it in the amendment log, and the only person who had accessed it at 6 in the morning was Connor." Diane looked serene about this, the way people look when they have been holding something patient, and it has finally found its moment. "He pulled the filing the morning of your Wednesday presentation, spent 40 minutes on it." Vivian was quiet for long enough that Paolo glanced over from behind the cart. "That was a coincidence," she said. "Vivian." Diane's voice was gentle and without mercy. "I have been in this building for 6 years. I have watched Connor Hahn work through 3 department restructures, a building systems crisis that nearly cost us the Streeterville contract, and one very bad Q4 where 2 project leads quit in the same month. I have seen him under pressure. I have seen him be generous." She paused. "I have never seen him pull a filing at 6 in the morning for someone who wasn't his direct report." The coffee cart hummed quietly. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. "He's being professional," Vivian said. The words felt, as she said them, like the lid of something she was trying to keep closed. He is, Diane agreed pleasantly. He's also not looking at anyone else the way he looks at you. Those two things can coexist. Vivian picked up her coffee. I've been here 5 weeks. I know. I left a marriage 6 months ago. I know that too. Diane's voice changed tone. Not softer exactly, but more exact. The voice of someone who has waited for precisely this moment and is going to use it carefully. And I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm telling you what I observe, because you are the type of person who will convince herself she's imagining things right up until it's too late to name them, and I would find that a shame. Vivian looked at the lake through the second-floor windows. She thought about the coffee appearing every morning. She thought about the zoning table sent at 6:15 a.m. She thought about 7 words in a break room on a Friday evening. She thought about her ex-husband, kind, respectable, present in all the technical ways, who had stopped seeing her so gradually that she hadn't noticed until there was nothing left to notice. And she thought about how, after 11 years of that, her first instinct when she felt seen by someone was to find the safest possible explanation for it. What if I'm wrong about what I'm reading? She asked. It was the first truly honest thing she had said to anyone at Meridian. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then you're wrong, and you deal with that when it comes. But you're not a person who is usually wrong about what she reads. Vivian said nothing. The fact that you're considering the possibility, Diane said quietly, is the most interesting thing you've done since you got here. If you've ever talked yourself out of something real because the alternative was trusting your own judgment, you know exactly what Vivian is holding right now. Stay close, because what's coming next changes everything. The board meeting was on a Thursday in November. Vivian had been at Meridian 8 weeks. She wore a dark blazer and arrived 6 minutes early, which in this room was exactly on time. The table seated 16. She sat in the middle, which was the correct position for a manager presenting to a board that hadn't decided yet whether to find her promising or peripheral. Connor wasn't there. He had a building systems review in Streeterville that morning, the quarterly one that required his physical presence. Marcus had mentioned it in passing, and Vivian had filed it under irrelevant information and then kept returning to it in a way that felt diagnostic. The presentation went well. She knew it went well because she had run it 3 times in the past 48 hours and had answers prepared for every question she could anticipate. The board was engaged. 2 of the property owners asked follow-up questions that signaled genuine interest. She felt, for the first time since arriving, the particular confidence of someone doing exactly what she was made to do. Then Richard Voss spoke. I want to clarify one element. He said it casually, in the tone of a man making a housekeeping observation. The operational variance on the Phase 1 implementation timeline. Whose modeling was that based on? He already knew. She was certain he already knew. That was modeled jointly between operations and my team, she said. Based on the Streeterville implementation from Q3. The Streeterville implementation had different environmental variables. He pulled a page from his folder, unhurried, the way you pull something when you've been waiting for the right moment to use it. The Phase 1 timeline as presented assumes a tenant turnover rate that doesn't account for the lease amendments we filed in August, which changes the projection by approximately 11 weeks. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Just the slight recalibration of people recalculating who has the upper ground. Vivian looked at the page he was holding. She had read that lease amendment. She had read everything. And the 11-week figure he was citing was not wrong, but it was also not the complete picture. It applied to 2 of the 7 properties in the Phase 1 scope, not all 7. A distinction that changed the projection materially. She could correct him. She had the numbers. She also knew, with the precision of someone who has been in rooms like this before, that correcting him publicly, in front of the board, in her 8th week, would be read as aggressive by at least 3 people at the table, and that this was exactly what he was counting on. Either she stayed quiet and let the error stand, or she corrected him, and gave him the opportunity to reframe her as difficult. She took a breath. Decided. "You're right that the August amendments affect 2 properties in the scope," she said evenly. "I've prepared a property-by-property breakdown that accounts for the variance. I can circulate it this afternoon so the board has the complete picture." A beat. Then one of the property owners nodded. That would be helpful. The meeting moved on. Voss did not look at her again. That, somehow, was its own kind of answer. She walked out of that conference room into the hallway and stood at the window for exactly 90 seconds, letting the lake settle her. When she turned around, Marcus was walking past, and he stopped. "Connor's back in the building," Marcus said. He didn't say it like it was information. He said it like it was something she might want to have. She found out later, through the meeting minutes that Connor reviewed without comment, that he had requested a copy of the boardroom recording by end of day, that he had written 1 line to Richard Voss in an email that she was not copied on, and that Marcus, with studied neutrality, had described only as direct. She asked Marcus once what the email had said. He said that any operational question about a project under joint scope should be raised with the relevant manager before the board meeting, not during it. Marcus paused. He used the word protocol. Connor only uses that word when he means something else. Vivian thought about a man in a Streeterville building who had taken the time to watch a recording of a board meeting he hadn't been present for, and who had then written a single line to the most powerful person in the building on her behalf, and who had not told her he had done it. She thought, "This is a problem." She thought, "This is not the kind of problem I know how to solve." And for the first time in 8 weeks, she didn't try. November 14th. Vivian knew the date the way you know certain dates. Not because you mark them, but because your body keeps the record when your mind has decided not to. The anniversary of signing the separation papers. 11 months ago, in a law office in Detroit, she had signed her name to the ending of 11 years and shaken a lawyer's hand and said thank you in the same voice she used for closing a lease agreement. She had done well with it. She had been doing well with it. Today was a bad day for doing well. She had gotten through the day entirely. That was something. She had handled the Streeterville follow-up call and the revised projections and a conversation with Diane about the Q4 review, and she had kept her face arranged in the correct configuration for all of it, and now it was 6:20, and the parking structure was mostly empty, and she was standing beside her car with her keys in her hand, not getting in. She wasn't crying. She wasn't going to cry. She was just standing, needing a moment before the drive home, before the apartment without the couch she still hadn't bought, before the silence that had been her choice and still, on certain days, pressed against her from all directions. She heard footsteps and turned, and it was Connor. He had his jacket on, keys in hand, walking toward his car 2 rows over. He saw her. He slowed. She watched him decide something. It took less than 2 seconds. He changed direction. He stopped a few feet from her, not close enough to be intrusive, not far enough to be distant, just present. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't say her name with the interrogative inflection that people use when they want to be invited into something. He just stood there, in the concrete gray of the parking structure, with the city audible and muted beyond the walls, and looked at her with the same evenness she had been cataloging for 2 months now. She said finally, "Bad day." "I know." He hadn't been watching her. She knew that. He meant, "I can see it right now, and I don't need the history." Something loosened. Slowly, with the specific resistance of something that has been held in one position for a very long time. "It's the date," she said. And she hadn't meant to say that. And she heard herself say it. And she didn't take it back. He was quiet for a moment, not filling it, just being in it with her. "You don't have to explain anything to me right now," he said. "Just don't be alone like this today." She looked at him. The lake gray of his jacket, the analog watch on his left wrist that she had been cataloging since the first week without letting herself understand why. The way his hands were at his sides, easy, not reaching for anything, She thought about the last time someone had stood next to her without asking her to perform something for it. She couldn't locate the memory. "I'm okay," she said, out of habit. The words were already shaped and gone before she'd chosen them. "I know you are," he said. And somehow, from him, it didn't feel like dismissal. It felt like the recognition she'd been performing toward all year. "Yes, you are capable of okay. That's not the question I'm asking." They stood there for another minute. The parking structure was cold. Traffic moved somewhere above them on the bridge. Then she said, "There's a place 2 blocks down that makes jerk chicken that's the closest I've found to what my mother used to make." A pause. "I haven't eaten since noon," he said. They walked 2 blocks in the November cold without discussing whether this was a thing they were doing, and they sat at a small table by a fogged window, and Vivian ate jerk chicken and rice and talked about nothing consequential for an hour and a half, and Connor listened the way he did everything, with full and patient attention. And she felt, for the first time in recent memory, something she had almost stopped recognizing: the specific ease of not being managed, of being in a room with someone who asked nothing of her but her actual presence. She went home and sat on the floor of her living room and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She was not okay. She was something more complicated than okay. She was, for the first time in longer than she could count, beginning. She decided that night that she wasn't going to leave the room before anything could become something. Not this time. And the moment she made that decision, everything changed, including the danger. It happened on a Saturday. They had not planned a Saturday. That was the part Vivian kept returning to. That there had been no plan, which meant there had also been no decision to make, which meant it had happened the way real things tend to happen, through accumulation, through proximity, through 2 people repeatedly being in the same orbit without acknowledging the gravity of it, until it was simply too late to call it casual. She had been at the office. She knew, because she had learned his rhythm by now without learning it on purpose, that he sometimes came in on Saturdays for the quiet, not to work so much as to think without the architecture of the work week imposing itself. He had mentioned it once, in passing, and she had stored it in the folder she kept insisting was labeled professional context. She was working on the Q4 variance report when he appeared at her doorway at 11 with 2 coffees from Paolo's cart, which was not open on Saturdays, which meant he had brought them from somewhere else. "You knew I was here," she said. "Your car was in the lot." He set 1 coffee on her desk, sat across from her, opened his laptop. Neither of them said another word for 40 minutes. It was the most comfortable silence she had inhabited in years. Around noon, she found an error in the projections, not hers, a data entry issue from the systems team, and made a sound of frustration, and he looked up. "The occupancy figures for Building 7, she said. "December through March. They've been input as residential when they should be commercial. Changes the revenue model." He leaned over, and she turned her laptop slightly toward him, and in the adjustment their hands were both on the edge of the screen at the same time, not touching, and then they were. 4 seconds, the back of his hand against hers. Neither of them moved. Then she shifted the laptop angle and he leaned back, and they both looked at the screen, with the focused attention of 2 people who had just decided something without saying a word about it. "Commercial rate applied to 7 buildings instead of 2, he said, voice even. "You'll want to rerun the full model." "I know," she said. She ran the model. He read his own documents. They worked through the afternoon with their coffees going cold in the way coffees do when you keep forgetting them, which Vivian noticed with a startled internal warmth. She was forgetting her coffee, not because she was too deep in her head to remember herself, but because she was too present with something else. At 3:15 she said, "Why do you still wear an analog watch?" He looked at it. The question had been sitting between them for 2 months, and she had finally said it out loud, and she wasn't going to walk it back. "I like to feel time passing," he said, "not just see it." She sat with that. "My mother used to say that's what grief does. Makes time feel like something you can touch." She hadn't said the word mother at work before. She hadn't said the word grief. Both arrived in the same sentence, and she held herself still waiting for the wrong response. The sympathy that becomes its own kind of burden, the question that requires narration. He said, "What was she like?" Just that. And Vivian, for the first time in longer than she could track, talked about her mother. Not carefully, not in the edited version she had deployed at family occasions and office small talk. She talked about the discipline that felt like love, and the silence that felt like strength, and the way her mother had kept everything running and demanded that Vivian do the same, and how there were days now, 2 years after losing her, when Vivian couldn't tell which of her habits had been chosen and which had been inherited from a woman who believed that not being a burden was the highest form of care. Connor listened. He didn't correct her or reframe her or offer her a perspective she hadn't asked for. He just received it, with the particular gravity of someone who understands that being listened to is not a small thing. At 4:30 she ran out of words and looked out the window at the Chicago afternoon and felt scraped clean in the way you feel after you have let something out that you had been carrying sealed for a very long time. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "I wanted to." They packed up at 5. In the elevator, she thought about saying something else and didn't. He thought about saying something and she could tell, the half-second pause, the contained breath, and didn't. The elevator opened on the lobby. They walked to their cars. He said, "Next Saturday." Not a question, not quite an invitation. Something in between. "Next Saturday," she agreed. She drove home with her hands steady on the wheel and her chest full of something she hadn't felt in so long. She had almost mistaken its absence for peace. She had no idea that by Monday morning, everything they had been quietly building would be threatened, not by them, but by someone who had been watching the whole time. The email arrived Monday at 8:07. Subject: Vivian Okafor Barnes, Internal Transfer Opportunity, NYC Branch. Sent from HR to Vivian with Richard Voss CC'd, which was the detail. HR did not copy department VPs on transfer inquiries unless those inquiries had been initiated by department VPs. Vivian read it twice. Then she read it the way she had been trained to read contracts, looking not at what was said, but at the structure of the saying. The email described a newly created senior role at Meridian's New York office. Elevated title, significant portfolio. The kind of opportunity that, on paper, looked like the natural next step for exactly the kind of talent profile Vivian had spent 8 weeks building here. It was also exactly designed to remove her from Chicago without appearing to. She sat with it for 20 minutes. She thought about Clause 7B. She thought about the board meeting. She thought about Richard Voss, who understood long games, who had been watching the alignment between her and Connor with the particular attention of a man who recognizes when an alliance is forming that he cannot control. Then she did the thing she had not expected to do. She didn't call Diane. She didn't go over the scenarios alone. She walked to Connor's office. He was at his desk. He looked up when she appeared at the doorway. And she watched something change in his expression. Not dramatic, never dramatic with him. Just a shift in stillness. The way a room changes when a window opens. She handed him her phone with the email on the screen. He read it. She watched him read it twice. She watched the contained quality in his jaw that she now recognized as the version of anger he permitted himself in professional settings. "Voss sent this to HR last Thursday," he said. It wasn't a question. "I believe so." He handed her phone back, set his hands flat on the desk, looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he asked. And there it was. The question nobody had asked her in so long that her first instinct was to deflect it. "What do you think I should do? What would you do? What is the correct professional response to this?" All the routes she knew for returning the decision to someone else, making it shared, making it less hers. She sat down in the chair across from him. "I don't want to go to New York," she said. He held her gaze, said nothing, gave her the space to finish. But I've been asking myself if that's a real reason or if I'm staying because I'm afraid to start over again. Or because I've actually found something here that's worth staying for. And I can't fully tell the difference yet. She paused. And I don't know how to make that decision when one of the factors in it is sitting across from me. The office was very quiet. He was quiet for a long moment. And then he said carefully, "The decision is yours." She felt something drop in her chest. "I know," she said. She waited. "You've been building something real here," he said. "In 8 weeks, the board saw it. Your team sees it." A pause. "I see it." He looked at her directly. "That doesn't disappear if you go. It goes with you." She thought, "This is the part where he tells me to stay, where the feeling becomes the argument, where I get to make my decision inside the net of someone else's wanting." He didn't say that. He said, "New York is a real opportunity. It was engineered to remove you. But that doesn't mean it's a bad opportunity. You're capable of building what you've built here anywhere." He stopped. "What I won't do is make this easier by making it about me. That's not fair to you." She stared at him. "That's the hardest thing anyone has ever done for me," she said. And her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had been cataloging for 2 months. The one that was almost expressionless and somehow contained everything. "You deserve decisions that are actually yours," he said. She left his office and stood at the elevator bank and pressed the button, and didn't move when the elevator arrived, and it closed without her. She thought about 11 years of a marriage where her decisions had been shaped by the presence of someone else, where "what do you want" had slowly been replaced by "what works for us," and "what works for us" had slowly become a question with only one answer that was never hers. She thought about the discipline of not being a burden. She thought about her mother, and how inheriting someone's strength can also mean inheriting their loneliness. She thought about a man who, when given the opportunity to make himself the reason she stayed, had refused. She took the stairs back up. She walked to his office doorway. He looked up. "I'm not going to New York," she said. "Not because of the engineering, not because the opportunity is bad." She stopped. "Because I'm not running from anything anymore. And I'm not running toward the wrong things either." She held his gaze. "I think you understand what I mean." He was quiet for a moment. "I do," he said. Outside, Chicago went about its November business, entirely indifferent to the specific, irreversible thing that had just happened on the 32nd floor of a glass building by the river. 2 weeks passed. They were the best 2 weeks Vivian had spent in recent memory, and she noticed that with the particular wariness of someone who has learned to distrust good weeks. She catalogued it carefully. The morning coffees, which had never stopped. The Saturday in the office that had become, without discussion, a standing arrangement. The conversations that moved easily now between the professional and the personal in a way that felt less like a crossing of lines and more like the discovery that the line had never been where she'd imagined it. She had written to HR declining the New York opportunity. She had CC'd no one. Voss had not responded. Connor's mother called him on a Thursday afternoon. Vivian heard the beginning of it from the hallway, the particular shift in his voice, the way his Korean softened the edges of his English in a way she hadn't heard before. She walked past without stopping, but she carried the sound of it for the rest of the afternoon. The man who was unhurried and measured at work, speaking to his mother in a voice that was something else entirely. Unguarded. Warm in a way that suggested the warmth was very old. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to have watched someone's professional face for months, and to catch just once a glimpse of the face underneath. On a Friday, Diane said, "He's invited you to his mother's for dinner." Vivian looked up from her laptop. "He hasn't said anything." "He's going to," Diane said. "He told Marcus. Marcus told me." A pause. "Marcus isn't supposed to tell people things. He knows this. He told me anyway, which means he wanted me to tell you, which means the whole system is working exactly as intended." Vivian said nothing. His mother's name is Janet, Diane said. She's 74. She feeds people before she greets them. Connor's been visiting her on Sunday afternoons for the past 30 years, which tells you everything you need to know about the man. The invitation came that afternoon, delivered in the uncomplicated way Connor delivered most things. A message that said simply, Sunday. My mother's, if you want. And then, after a beat, no pressure in either direction. Vivian wrote back, I'll bring something. He wrote, she'll refuse it and then love that you brought it. She arrived at Janet Hand's apartment in Lincoln Square with a box of honey cakes from a Korean bakery she had found through 30 minutes of research. Janet opened the door, looked at the box, said, You didn't have to do that, and immediately put them on a plate. Vivian sat at a kitchen table with mismatched chairs and the smell of doenjang jjigae, and the specific warmth of a home that has been lived in honestly, and Janet Han served her food before asking a single question. Connor sat across from her looking like a man who was trying to look like he wasn't watching anything. Janet was direct in the way of women who have decided that politeness and honesty are not enemies. She asked Vivian about her work with genuine curiosity. She asked about Detroit with no self-consciousness. She told a story about Connor at 22, with the dry affection of someone who has earned the right to embarrass the people she loves. She laughed with her whole face. At one point, while Connor was washing dishes, Janet looked at Vivian with the unhurried appraisal of someone who has been alive long enough to read things quickly. He's been different lately, she said. Vivian kept her expression even. In what way? Like himself, Janet said. He was himself before, you understand. But like more of himself. She picked up her tea. That happens when a person has somewhere worth going. Connor came back from the kitchen. Janet changed the subject without transition. Walking back to the car later, the November air clean and cold, Vivian and Connor walked close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved to correct it. She approved, Connor said. She didn't say that. She put the honey cakes on the good plate, he said. That's the whole review. Vivian laughed, sudden and unplanned, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded. And he looked at her sideways with something in his expression that she no longer tried to name neutrally. She knew what it was. She had known for some time. In the car, before starting the engine, she said, Your mother mentioned a brother. The air changed. Yes, he said after a moment. He died when we were young. Michael, 14 years old. He looked at the windshield. It's why the way she feeds people. The way she doesn't waste a moment. She learned that time doesn't ask permission. Vivian thought about patience. About a man who gave people exactly the space they needed and never pushed and always stayed. She thought about where that came from. Not as a professional quality, not as a temperament, but as something shaped by the specific weight of a loss never quite put down. I think, she said carefully, that you came out of that with a different relationship to waiting than most people. He looked at her. What do you mean? You don't wait like someone who's being patient. You wait like someone who knows that the right moment is worth being present for. She paused. That's not a small thing. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd said too much. Then, nobody has ever said that to me. The city was dark outside the windows. Lincoln Square quiet on a Sunday night. She took his hand. Not dramatically. Not as a declaration. The way you reach for something you have been reaching toward for a long time and finally allow yourself to arrive at. He held it. They sat there for a while in the car, with Chicago going about its business outside and nothing needing to be decided or explained or named. Some things don't need words. They need presence. They need two people deciding at the same moment that staying is the answer. December arrived with the specific light of a city that dresses itself for the cold. Vivian bought a couch. This was not a dramatic event. It was a brown leather sofa from a furniture store in Wicker Park, and she had it delivered on a Saturday morning, and when it was in place, she sat down on it and felt the specific satisfaction of someone who has decided, concretely and with both feet, that she is staying somewhere. The office had shifted. Not visibly. Not in the way that gossip calcifies and circulates. But Diane moved through it with a barely suppressed knowing expression. Marcus had begun setting Connor's schedule with 30-minute buffers on Tuesday afternoons that corresponded consistently to no meetings whatsoever. Richard Voss had applied for a lateral transfer to the Boston office in early December, a move that HR processed with the quiet efficiency of a company that had long since taken its own measure of him. Vivian noticed all of this. She catalogued it with the same precision she had always applied to her environment. But for the first time, the cataloging felt less like defense and more like appreciation. On a Tuesday in December, she arrived at 7:50 and found the coffee on the corner of her desk and sat down with it and drank it while it was still hot and thought about nothing in particular and felt something she recognized finally as peace. Not the performed kind. Not the managed quiet of someone who has decided not to feel anything difficult. The real kind. The kind that has room for difficulty inside it because the ground is solid enough to hold it. Connor came by at 9 with a question about the Q1 portfolio review. They talked for 12 minutes about projections and transition timelines and a lease amendment in River North that had just cleared legal. They talked like colleagues. They talked like two people who know each other well enough that the professional and the personal are not compartments, but simply different rooms in the same house. When he left, she sat for a moment looking at the doorway. She thought about the first day, the conference room, her bag strap in her hands like an anchor. A man across the table who had looked at her, really looked, and seen not just what was present, but what was being held in place by will alone. She thought about the year before that, the separation, the boxes, the drive out of Detroit on a Tuesday morning in April when the weather was ambivalent and she had the radio off and her hands steady, and she had told herself that starting over was courage, and almost believed it. She thought about her mother, about discipline as love and love as discipline, and how she had spent 43 years inheriting both and learning to tell them apart. She thought about Connor standing in a parking structure in November saying, "Don't be alone like this today," and how that had been the first sentence in some time that had gone all the way in instead of stopping at the surface. She picked up her phone and texted him. "Dinner tonight?" 3 minutes later, "Yes, I know a place." She set her phone down and opened the Q1 review and worked for 4 focused hours without forgetting her coffee once. That evening, at a small restaurant on the north side with windows fogged by the cold and a table too small for people who were not accustomed to being close, Vivian and Connor sat across from each other and talked the way they had been talking for months, with the ease of people who no longer need to protect themselves from each other. And at some point in the middle of a conversation about nothing consequential, she looked at him and felt the specific recognition of someone who has arrived. Somewhere real. Not rescue. Not resolution. Not the storm that announces itself with drama and departs with equal noise. Rest. The specific, irreplaceable rest of being with a person who has seen you clearly. Not the curated version. Not the performance. Not the competence you wear to protect yourself. And stayed. Who has chosen presence, repeatedly, and without announcement, until presence became home? She had been the one who left a life that had stopped seeing her. She had been the one who changed cities and sold the furniture and decided to begin. And she had done it afraid, most of it, afraid of repeating the same arc, afraid of trusting herself after trusting badly for so long, afraid that what she read in a person's eyes might be projection, might be want, might be the loneliness inside her mistaking attention for something more durable. She had been wrong to be afraid of this. "You know what's strange," she said. He looked up. "I keep waiting for the part where this gets complicated." He considered that, with the honest thoughtfulness she had catalogued since week 1. "It will," he said. "Eventually. Things do." "I know." She looked at him. "I think what I mean is, I keep waiting for the part where I want to leave the room." He was quiet for a moment. "And?" She picked up her glass, looked at him across the small table, in the fogged light of a December restaurant, in a city she had chosen and was choosing again. "I don't," she said. Outside, Chicago moved through its evening, the lake invisible in the dark, the streets lit and busy, the river reflecting the towers back at themselves. A city doing what cities do, continuing, indifferent, enormous. Inside, two people at a small table with cold wine and warm bread, and the unhurried luxury of nowhere they had to be. The bag strap was in her lap. She wasn't holding it. She had spent years carrying everything with 2 fingers on an anchor. And the moment she put it down, not because someone told her to, but because she finally had somewhere solid to stand, was the moment the story that actually mattered had begun. On the first Tuesday of the new year, Vivian arrived at Meridian at 7:40, not 7:50. Not the cautious 10 minutes that had been since the beginning, both her comfort and her strategy. 40 minutes early, which was unusual enough that Marcus, who arrived at 7:45 himself, looked at her desk with a mild expression of recalibration. She was not reviewing reports. She was not running projections. She had her coffee, her own, from Paulo's cart, which opened at 7:30. And she was watching the lake. January light on Chicago water is unforgiving. It doesn't flatter. It shows things as they are. She had always appreciated that about mornings here, the clarity of them. It had felt, in October when she arrived, like an appropriate metaphor for starting over. Cold, clear, nothing soft about it. It felt different now. The same clarity. But clarity, she had learned, is not a fixed thing. What it illuminates changes depending on where you're standing when you look. She had been standing somewhere different for a while now. She hadn't announced it. It had simply become true the way most real things become true. Not through a single decision, but through the accumulation of small ones. Through choosing, again and again, not to leave the room before something could become something. Connor arrived at 7:50. He saw her, checked his watch, looked back at her. "You're early," he said. "I know." He poured his coffee, came to stand beside her at the window, both of them looking at the lake. Their coffees steamed in the morning air. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. That was all. And it was enough. It was, in fact, exactly right. The weight of it, the ease of it, the fact that they could stand at a window in the morning and say only that, and have it contain everything. She thought about the first day. The conference room. The way she had held her bag strap like something to hold on to. The way she had been performing a whole self from nothing more than discipline and will. She thought about how she had walked out of that room, and he had watched her leave, and neither of them had known what was beginning. She thought about the Friday evenings and the Saturday offices and the parking structure in November. She thought about Janet's kitchen. She thought about a dinner table in December and a woman who had finally stopped waiting for the part where she wanted to leave. She thought, the greatest risk was never getting hurt again. The greatest risk was continuing to be very good at not needing anyone and calling that survival. She had done extraordinary things with that survival. She had built competence and capability and a professional record that was entirely, deservedly hers. She did not dismiss any of it, but she understood now the distinction between what had helped her endure and what had prevented her from arriving. To arrive was different from to start over. Starting over was the brave thing she had done in April, the packing, the drive, the new city. Arriving was what happened when you decided that this, here, the specific, imperfect present in front of you, was worth being fully inside. She had arrived. Connor drank his coffee. She drank hers. The lake turned silver with the rising light. "Ready?" he said. The elevator was waiting. The floor was filling. The day was beginning in the way days begin when the ground under you is solid, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary accumulated weight of work and weather and everything that asks something of you by Tuesday morning, but solid. The kind of solid that holds. "Yes," she said. And she was. Mature love doesn't arrive with a spark. It arrives when you finally allow yourself to rest near someone,